Numbers chapter 1, verses 1 through 54. Bible Study and Exposition, KJV. Introduction. Welcome, everyone. Today we are going to study Numbers chapter 1, verses 1 through 54. At first glance, this chapter may look like a simple census record, filled with names and numbers. But in reality, Numbers chapter 1 contains deep spiritual meaning about God's order, God's purpose, God's people, and God's presence. The book of Numbers stands between Leviticus and Deuteronomy. In Genesis, God promised Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation. In Exodus, God delivered Israel from slavery in Egypt. In Leviticus, God taught his people how to live as a holy nation. Now in Numbers, God begins preparing his people for their journey toward the promised land. The wilderness was not their final destination. It was a place of preparation. And in the same way, many believers today are walking through spiritual wilderness seasons, seasons of waiting, seasons of testing, seasons where God is shaping faith, obedience, and spiritual maturity. Numbers chapter 1 teaches us that God is not absent in the wilderness. He is organizing, preparing, training, and guiding his people for a greater purpose. 1. God speaks from the tabernacle. Numbers chapter 1 verses 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of the congregation. This is very important. God speaks from the tabernacle. The tabernacle represented the presence of God among his people. Israel had already experienced miracles. They crossed the Red Sea. They saw manna from heaven. They received the law at Mount Sinai. But now God begins preparing them for movement. Before God moves his people, he first speaks to them. This is still true today. Many people want direction from God, but they do not spend time listening to God. God's guidance always begins with God's voice. Spiritually, this teaches us that God does not lead his people through confusion. He leads through his word. The wilderness may feel uncertain, but God's voice brings clarity. 2. Why did God command a census? Numbers chapter 1, verses 2 through 3. God commands Moses to count every man 20 years old and upward, who is able to go to war. Why was this census important? First, it revealed the fulfillment of God's promise. When Abraham first received God's promise, he had no child. Humanly speaking, the promise seemed impossible. But now Israel had become a massive nation. God always keeps his promises. Sometimes God's promises take time. Sometimes believers become discouraged because they do not see immediate results. But Numbers chapter 1 reminds us that God is faithful, even when fulfillment takes years. Second, the census prepared Israel for spiritual battle. Israel was not called to remain comfortable in the wilderness forever. They were moving toward the promised land. But entering the promised land required warfare. Spiritually, believers today are also in a spiritual battle. The Christian life is not only about comfort and blessings. It is also about spiritual warfare, faith, endurance, obedience, and perseverance. Ephesians teaches that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual darkness. God was preparing Israel to become disciplined and organized. In the same way, God prepares believers spiritually through prayer, scripture, trials, and obedience. 3. God knows his people personally. Numbers chapter 1 verses 4 through 19. This section lists leaders from every tribe. Many people skip these names while reading the Bible, but every name matters to God. This reveals something beautiful about God's character. God does not see his people as anonymous numbers. He knows individuals personally. The world often measures people by success, money, appearance, or influence. But God looks deeper. God sees hidden tears, hidden prayers, hidden struggles, hidden faithfulness. Psalm 139 teaches that God knows us completely. Even in the wilderness, God knew every tribe, every family, and every person. Spiritually, this is powerful encouragement. Sometimes believers feel forgotten, ignored, invisible. But Numbers chapter 1 reminds us that God never loses track of his people. He knows your name. He knows your pain. He knows your prayers. And he remembers every act of faithfulness. 4. God is a God of order. Numbers chapter 1 verses 20 through 46. Each tribe is counted carefully and specifically. Nothing is random. God organized Israel with structure and order. Why? Because God is not the author of confusion. The wilderness itself was chaotic and dangerous. But God established divine order in the middle of uncertainty. This reveals an important spiritual truth. God often builds order inside spiritual chaos. Many people today live emotionally unstable lives. Their minds are overwhelmed. Their priorities are broken. But God desires spiritual order. Order in prayer, order in worship, order in faith, order in obedience. A healthy spiritual life does not happen accidentally. God trains his people through discipline. The wilderness was not punishment alone. It was preparation. Sometimes God allows wilderness seasons because he is developing spiritual maturity. Before entering greater blessings, believers must first learn obedience. 5. The special calling of the Levites. Numbers chapter 1, verses 47 through 53. The tribe of Levi was not counted with the military tribes. Why? Because the Levites had a different calling. They were assigned to care for the tabernacle and protect the holiness of worship. This reveals one of the deepest spiritual lessons in Numbers chapter 1. Israel's true strength was not military power. Their true strength was God's presence. Without God's presence, the nation would collapse. The tabernacle stood at the center of Israel, because God himself was meant to remain at the center of the nation. This is deeply relevant today. Modern society often places success, money, achievement, and entertainment at the center of life. But Scripture teaches that without God, everything eventually becomes empty. Prayerless strength eventually fails. Success without God eventually becomes meaningless. The Levites remind believers that worship must remain central. Prayer must remain central. God's presence must remain central. Spiritually speaking, every believer today is called to protect their spiritual altar. Your heart must become a place where God's presence dwells continually. 6. Spiritual lessons for today. Numbers chapter 1 teaches several important lessons for modern believers. First, God prepares people before promotion. Before Israel entered Canaan, they had to learn discipline and obedience. Likewise, before God releases greater responsibility, he often trains believers through wilderness seasons. Second, God values every individual. The census reminds us that no believer is forgotten. Even when nobody else notices your faithfulness, God sees it. Third, spiritual victory requires spiritual preparation. Prayer matters. Worship matters. Scripture matters. Many believers want victory without preparation, but God trains his people before battle. Fourth, God's presence must remain central. Without God's presence, even strong people become weak. Without worship, the soul becomes spiritually dry. Without prayer, spiritual sensitivity disappears. This is why believers must continually return to God's presence. Conclusion. Numbers chapter 1 is far more than a census. It is a revelation of God's heart. God remembers his people. God organizes his people. God prepares his people. And God dwells among his people. The wilderness was not proof that God abandoned Israel. It was proof that God was preparing them. In the same way, difficult seasons in life do not mean God has left you. Sometimes God is developing faith, endurance, humility, and spiritual maturity. God knows your name. God knows your struggle. And God is still leading his people toward his promises. Even in the wilderness, God is working. Trust him. Follow him. Remain faithful to him. Thank you.